The committee will come to order. A quorum being present, without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any point. Pursuant to Committee Rule 3 and House Rule 11, the chair announces that the chair may postpone further proceedings today on any vote relating to any matter under consideration. During today's markup, without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and to submit additional materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. The committee meets today pursuant to notice to consider the following measures: Kleptocracy, that is H.R. 389, Asset Recovery Rewards Act, H.R. 1500, the Consumers First Act, H.R. 1595, the Safe Banking Act, H.R. 1815, the SEC Disclosure, Effectiveness Testing Act, and H.R. 1856, the Ending Homelessness Act. The chair notes that amendments that were filed 24 hours in advance of the markup will have priority for consideration. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes on the measures under consideration today. Today, this committee convenes for a markup of 5 overdue bills. As I've said before, under my leadership, this committee will be focused on fairness and policies to benefit consumers, investors, small businesses, and our economy. In advancing these bills today, the committee is taking action to combat foreign corruption and the national homelessness crisis, ensure that legitimate businesses have access to the banking system, and put consumers and investors first. And I'm pleased to say that several of the bills we're marking up today already have bipartisan support. And I hope my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will join us in voting for all of these common sense measures. Today, we will consider the Kleptocracy Assets Recovery Rewards Act, H.R. 389, introduced by Representatives Lynch and Budd, which creates a Treasury-based rewards program to incentivize individuals to notify the U.S. government of stolen assets that are linked to foreign government corruption. This bill takes important steps to improve the federal government's ability to fight foreign corruption and kleptocracy. Next, we will consider my bill, the Ending Homelessness Act, H.R. 1856, which provides $13.27 billion in new funding over 5 years to federal programs and initiatives to prevent homelessness. It includes funding for new units of affordable housing, new vouchers, case management, and technical assistance. There are currently over 500,000 people exercising or experiencing, homelessness nationwide, which is a travesty. Congress has an obligation to provide the resources necessary to ensure that every American has a safe, affordable place to call home. We will also consider the Safe Banking Act, H.R. 1595, put forth by Representatives Perlmutter, Heck, Stivers, and Davison, which provides state-authorized and regulated cannabis businesses with the ability to access the banking system, and provides clarity for banks that they may serve these businesses, their employees, as well as ancillary businesses that provide services to these businesses. This bill addresses an urgent public safety concern for legitimate businesses that currently have no recourse but to operate with just cash. However, I also view this bill as part of a holistic approach towards providing criminal justice reform to those who have been harmed by criminalization of marijuana, and should not by any means be the only bill that the House takes up on the important issue of cannabis reform. Additionally, we will consider the SEC Disclosure Effectiveness Testing Act, H.R. 1815, introduced by Representative Caston. H.R. 1815 would require the SEC to test any new disclosure intended for retail investors under the SEC's proposed regulation, Best Interest. It would also require the SEC to review and test its existing disclosures for retail investors such as mutual fund disclosures. Retirement savers not only deserve advice that is in their best interest, they also deserve to understand the disclosures that are supposed to be in place for their protection. Lastly, we will consider the Consumers First Act, H.R. 1500, my bill to reverse the harmful structural changes Mick Mulvaney made at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and to ensure that the Consumer Bureau is fully empowered to carry out its mission. The Consumer Bureau is an absolutely critical agency for American consumers, and this committee will not stand by while the Trump administration tears it down from the inside. Finally, I thank the members for their work on these common sense bills and urge all of the members of the committee to support the legislation. I now yield 5 minutes to the distinguished ranking member, Mr. McHenry, for his opening statement on these measures.
Thank you, Chairwoman Waters. I'll be brief and save more substantive comments for each bill as they come forward and they come up today and tomorrow. I would like to thank Chairwoman Waters for working with the Republican side of the aisle to make changes to the Kleptocracy Asset Recovery Rewards Act. As I said early on to you, Chairwoman Waters, Committee Republicans stand ready to work with you when you reach across the aisle, and I stand ready to work with you when you reach across the aisle. I believe the Kleptocracy Asset Recovery Rewards Act is a good example of this, and unfortunately for this markup, a rare example of bipartisan cooperation and trying to seek commonality for goals that we see similarly. Together, we crafted the strongest bill possible on kleptocracy, and I and my colleagues look forward to supporting it. Beyond this, I'm concerned with the rest of the markup agenda. I'm particularly concerned about the partisan message the remaining bills send to our constituents, consumers, and public at large. I don't want our constituents to think that this is just Congress at work as usual, partisan vote after partisan vote, but unfortunately, we see a lot of that. Take, for example, H.R. 1815, the SEC Disclosure Effectiveness Testing Act. Sounds good. Did you know the SEC already conducts investor testing on regulations which they bring forward? Did you know the SEC worked with the RAND Corporation to conduct both in-person interviews as well as a nationwide survey on the form CRS, as a result of which I'm holding their very report today. If the SEC is already doing what you want, what is it you really want to accomplish with this bill? A different outcome on a regulation? A different regulation entirely? Is your goal just to stop the SEC from promulgating rules? Or take, for example, H.R. 1500, the Consumer First Act. I know of the animus that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle hold towards former Director Mick Mulvaney. We all know him well as a former member of the House, but I know your view of him and the actions he took as director of the CFPB. But will codifying your agenda, bringing accountability and transparency to the CFPB operations, actually achieve what you want? If you really want to make the agency accountable to the American people, let's start with the fundamentals. Change the CFPB's organizational structure, its fundamental mechanisms, create an Office of Inspector General. There are fundamental reforms we can have for this agency so it can endure and last, all of which would bring greater transparency and accountability. Instead, we have Republicans having a different view of this tinkering with this agency that was created in Dodd-Frank. As I said a minute ago, Republicans stand ready to work with you in these areas. I want to move forward on policies that benefit all Americans. In fact, there's not one person on this committee who does not want to end homelessness. But authorizing $13 billion in new mandatory spending over 5 years actually won't end homelessness. It feeds a broken system that will not yield results. In fact, one of our witnesses testified that more federal money is not the solution. We need to make sure that we're protecting our most vulnerable populations. We need to ensure that we're working with state and local governments to remove barriers to affordable housing. These are the things we should be legislating on to help end homelessness. I'm saying to you, let's work together on these policies. Not one conversation was had on achieving a bipartisan result on ending homelessness. That is a missed opportunity. Finally, a few words on H.R. 1595. Madam Chairwoman, I wrote to you and Subcommittee Chair Meeks asking for a delay of this measure. Some on my side support the measure as written. Many oppose it. Most importantly for this committee, we need to ensure that we're doing our due diligence before proceeding. One committee hearing is not enough to fully understand the consequences of this bill. It is a massive change in federal policy. I would once again encourage you to delay consideration of this measure until the most fundamental questions have been answered, reviewed, and addressed. One brief legislative hearing is not enough for a massive undertaking that this committee seeks to do with just one bill in the markup. I yield back.
The chair now calls up H.R. 389, Kleptocracy, Asset Recovery Rewards Act. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 389, to authorize the Secretary of the Treasury to pay rewards under an Asset Recovery Awards program. Without
objection, the first reading of H.R. 389 is dispensed with. The chair understands that the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch, the sponsor of the bill, is offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed in advance and are at the dais. The clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 389, offered by Mr. Lynch of Massachusetts. Strike all after the enacting clause and insert the following. Section 1, short title. A, this act may be cited as the Kleptocracy Asset Recovery Reward.
Without objection, the amendment is in the nature of a substitute will be considered as read and considered base text for purposes of further amendment. I now recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts for 5 minutes to explain the bill and his amendment.
Thank you very much, Chairwoman Waters, and I also want to thank the ranking member for the opportunity to present the Kleptocracy Asset Recovery Rewards Act. I also want to thank my colleague, the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Budd, for his hard work in developing and co-sponsoring this legislation, as well as the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen. The incidence of foreign dictators who rob the treasuries of developing nations where independent judiciaries are rare and the rule of law is often weak is not a new problem, but it is a growing problem. According to the World Bank, more than $1 trillion is lost to bribes and official corruption around the world each year, and as much as $40 billion is lost in developing countries due to low-level garden variety corruption. A significant portion of these illicit proceeds are used to support organized crime and further destabilize the social institutions where this corruption occurs, often in developing countries who can least afford it. This, in turn, serves to undermine the rule of law and regional security of neighboring countries. Governments weakened by corruption and suffering the resulting loss of capital and creditworthiness face limited capacity and have fewer resources to provide basic services, establish a stable business climate, and create jobs. They also have fewer resources to devote to building strong financial, law enforcement, and judicial institutions to combat exploitation by terrorists and criminal organizations. The Financial Accountability and Corporate Transparency Coalition has reported that, and this is a quote, corruption undermines the rule of law, provides the lifeblood of authoritarian regimes, and enables transnational organized crime to flourish, close quote, and that this can foster the rise of terrorism networks themselves. And it is a sad fact that today, much of this stolen money ends up in bank accounts right here in the United States. Our bill, H.R. 389, fights back against the spreading influence of this corruption. The Kleptocracy Asset Recovery Rewards Act establishes a rewards program to incentivize individuals to notify law enforcement authorities of assets stolen from foreign treasuries and illegally transferred to the U.S. This allows law enforcement, acting on behalf of the victims residing in developing nations, to identify, recover, and return these stolen assets, thereby thwarting criminal activity and reducing the risk of terrorist financing. Importantly, the incentive rewards are paid from recovered assets. While the United States has many effective programs to reward individuals who provide valuable information toward curbing criminal behavior, and while our Financial Intelligence Unit, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, has successfully utilized this model in isolated cases, none of these programs has been codified to specifically take aim at recovering stolen assets linked to foreign government kleptocracy. Kleptocracy by foreign leaders can drain the hope and faith of struggling peoples around the world who strive for social justice and equal rights. This bill recognizes that foreign corruption takes many forms and that individuals who come forward to expose corruption often do so at great risk to themselves and their families. So as transnational criminal activity persists and terrorist organizations continue to adapt, we must provide law enforcement with new and effective tools to address these emerging threats. H.R. 389 does that. In closing, I want to thank Chairwoman Waters for her unwavering and courageous leadership on this issue, as well as my colleague and co-sponsor, the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Budd, and my colleague, the gentleman from Tennessee, Steve Cohen. Thank you to my many colleagues on both sides of the aisle for working with me on this legislation, and I ask for a yes vote. I yield back.
Is there a discussion of this amendment? If there is no discussion,
I'd like to speak.
Okay.
I move to strike the
Budd.
last word.
You recognize for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to first thank the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch, for taking the lead on this very important issue. This makes 2 bills in the terrorism and illicit financing space on which we've worked. We had H.R. 56, which is the Financial Technology Protection Act. We were able to work together on. I believe that passed unanimously. And now H.R. 389, which is being marked up today. So I'm excited to continue working with you, Mr. Lynch, and also to be the lead Republican on this bill. I also want to thank my friend Ranking Member McHenry for his support of the bill and the amendment in the nature of a substitute today. And finally, I want to acknowledge Chairwoman Waters and her staff for hearing the Republican concerns and making sure that they were addressed so that we can make this bill strong and bipartisan. Madam Chair, it is estimated by the World Bank and the United Nations that $20 to $40 billion is lost annually through government corruption or kleptocracy, with only $5 billion being repatriated over the past decade. This, of course, is a tremendous loss to our society. These stolen funds due to government corruption mean that developing countries have less resources to fight terrorism or to fund law enforcement. It means they have less funds to build roads, schools, and to provide adequate infrastructure for their own country. While the United States already has some great programs dedicated to stopping this problem through the Department of Justice and the State Department, for example, I do believe we need more resources to protect the integrity of our financial system, and that's what H.R. 389 will help do if enacted. Our legislation establishes within the Treasury Department a kleptocracy asset recovery rewards program to be used for rewards payments to support U.S. government programs and investigations aimed at eliminating any stolen assets linked to foreign government corruption in the U.S.-based financial accounts. Madam Chair, I do believe it is critical that we use resources to encourage people to come forward with information, and that's what I attempted to do with my earlier bill, H.R. 56. And I do believe that this program that Representative Lynch and I are proposing would allow offices like Treasury's Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence to use incentives and rewards to build on their already successful and important work. I think this bill is smart. I think it will work. And I know it will help our heroes behind the scenes at Treasury who work tirelessly every day to protect the integrity of our financial system. I hope this bill strikes everyone here, as it did me, as just a common sense proposal. To close, again, I want to thank Ranking Member McHenry and Chairwoman Waters for their support of this ANS and this bill. And also want to thank again Mr. Lynch for his continued leadership on TIF-related issues. And I urge all of my colleagues to support this measure before us today. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Will the gentleman yield?
I yield to the ranking member.
Well, I want to thank you. Thank you, Congressman Budd. Thank you, Congressman Lynch, for crafting a very good bill. I want to thank Chairwoman Waters and her able staff for working with us on perfecting this good idea. As Treasury has testified before this committee, information is really the foundation of rooting out illicit finance and targeting bad actors. This committee has been adept over the years at making sure the technical pieces work so that we can do this in other areas. And so this is a continuation of that effort that is bipartisan, longstanding and bipartisan. But it's also an additional idea, making sure that we have incentives to make this information gathering possible and real. And so I do want to thank the authors of this, as well as Chairwoman Waters, for what we now have before us. In working with us to make sure there's not, minimize the unintended consequences, make sure there's proper congressional oversight and judicial review. I would urge my colleagues all to support this measure and yield back to my colleague, Mr. Budd, my friend and neighbor, Mr. Budd.
Thank the ranking member, and I yield back the balance of my time to the chair.
Thank you very much. Let me strike the last word. H.R. 389, the Kleptocracy Asset Recovery Reward Act, establishes a Treasury-based rewards program to incentivize individuals to notify the U.S. government of stolen assets that are linked to foreign government corruption. These assets include high-end luxury items like mansions, jets, and museum-quality artwork, in addition to cash, and are controlled by U.S. persons. Through this whistleblower rewards program, U.S. authorities will be better able to identify, recover, and return these assets to victims. The FBI and its law enforcement partners already work hard to find these stolen assets. They have recently recovered, for example, an estimated $140 million for Malaysia through the seizure and sale of the partial ownership of New York's famed Park Lane Hotel. It was previously brought and laundered money from the multi-billion-dollar 1MDB scandal involving Goldman Sachs that defrauded the people of Malaysia. Also related to the 1MDB scandal, the FBI has identified $1.7 billion of the stolen assets laundered into a yacht, artwork, and real estate. Similarly, in the corruption and money laundering cases against the Equatorial Guinea's President Obiang and his son, the U.S. helped to recover over $30 million from the sale of real estate, a Ferrari, and rare music memorabilia. Most of the resultant funds were given by the U.S. to a charity that benefited the people of Equatorial Guinea. The bill would direct the Treasury to pay rewards for helping to uncover assets like those to whistleblowers from the proceeds of the recovered stolen assets. Modeled after similar programs at agencies like the Internal Revenue Service and the U.S. Department of State, this bill will go a long way in helping to punish and deter the bad acts these foreign criminals and helping victims and their countries recover from the effects of corruption. So I not only thank Mr. Lynch and Mr. Budd for introducing this bill and believe that they are correct, that this program would improve the ability of the United States to make corruption less profitable and more expensive for the criminals who fleece their country's coffers. And so I'd also like to thank the ranking member, Mr. McHenry, for his leadership and for his support, working along with Mr. Lynch and Mr. Budd for bringing us to this point of being able to present a program that I think will be extremely beneficial. And so I support this anti-kleptocracy bill and the gentleman's amendment along with that. Is there further discussion of our amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 389? Anybody else? Who else? Mrs. Stivers. For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
To strike the last word.
Mr. Stivers, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
I'll be very brief. I want to thank the gentleman from Massachusetts and the subcommittee chairman, Mr. Cleaver, for their work on this. In the amendment in the nature of a substitute, they did make some changes on page 11 to make it stronger, to make sure that one bad guy can't turn on another bad guy and receive a reward from the government. I would like to work with the gentleman from Massachusetts on the way to the floor with this bill, because I do have a concern that the reasonable basis to believe or know might not be strong enough because it doesn't require any due diligence on behalf of the secretary to actually look into whether this individual getting a reward had anything to do with it. And if they don't look into it, they have no reasonable basis to believe and can just give away the reward, which I just want to make sure if there's a way to strengthen it a little more, we can. I'm going to vote for the bill today, but I'd love to work with the gentleman as we move forward on that. But I think the idea of the bill is good, and I want to make sure that we make it the best bill we can on the way to the floor. I yield back the balance of my time, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Is there further discussion of our
Madam
amendments?
Chair,
Yes.
I move to strike last word.
Who's being recognized? Yes. Mr. Duffy, did you raise? Ooh.
Move to strike last word.
Mr. Cleaver, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I won't take the entire 5 minutes. But I'd like to thank my friend and my colleague, Mr. Lynch from Massachusetts, for championing this important bill. We held a legislative hearing on this 2 weeks ago, and I'm glad to see that we're now marking it up. This is very important. We need to look to Syria, Venezuela, and North Korea as examples of corrupt regimes. And theology, we always have to go back to the root meaning of words. And so the kleptocracy actually comes from the Greek word kleptos, which means I steal. And that's exactly what's happening. $2.6 trillion, according to the United States, is lost in corruption, and that's 5% of the world's gross domestic product. So I'd like to thank Congressman Lynch and Republican colleagues for their work on this bill. And I think because we're having a bipartisan bill, we have a good chance of garnering Senate support. Congratulations. Thank you, Mr. Lynch. I yield back.
Is there further debate on the amendment? If not, the question occurs on the amendment. All those in favor of the amendment say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, nay.
Madam Chair, request a roll call.
Who's getting recognized? A roll call has been requested. All in favor of recorded vote shall raise their hand and be counted. There is sufficient second, and a recorded vote is also ordered. Pursuant to Section C5 of Rule 3 of the Committee Rules, the vote on this question is postponed. If there are no more amendments with the recorded vote, we're now going to move on to the next bill. Without objection, the previous question is ordered. I suppose it has been ordered on 389, and further proceedings on recorded votes are postponed. The question, just a moment.
Madam Chair.
The chair now calls up H.R. 1856, the End Homelessness Act of 2019. The staff has to stop doing this stuff.
Madam Chair. Madam Chair.
Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Madam Chair, in light of the fact that this might be the only bill we agree on all day, I'd like to withdraw my request for a roll call.
The gentleman from Massachusetts has requested a withdrawal from the roll call. Without objection, such is the order.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
A majority having voted aye, H.R. 389 as amended is reported favorably to the House. Without objection, committee staff is authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes. Pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2L, all committee members will have the right to file with the clerk of the committee supplemental, additional, minority, and dissenting views. Now that that has been cleared up, the chair now calls up H.R. 1856, the End in Homelessness Act of 2019. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 1856, a bill to provide a path to end homelessness in the United States and for other purposes, be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled. Section 1, short title. This act may be cited as the Ending Homelessness Act of 2019. Section 2, congressional findings. The Congress finds that, 1, although the United States has experienced a reduction in veteran homelessness.
Without objection, the first reading of H.R. 1856 is dispensed with. And the chair offers an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed in advance or on the dais. The clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1856 offered by Ms. Waters of California. Strike all after the enacting clause and insert the following. Section 1, short title. This act may be cited as the Ending Homelessness Act of 2019. Section 2, congressional findings. The Congress finds that, 1, although the United States has experienced a reduction in veteran homelessness after a surge of new federal funding targeted to homeless veterans starting in fiscal year 2008, major progress toward the national goals for ending homelessness in our nation has virtually stalled in the absence of increased funding. According to the Department of Housing and Urban Development's 2018...
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute will be considered as read and considered base text for purposes of further amendment. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to explain the bill and the amendment. There are few issues under our committee's jurisdiction that are more pressing than the issue of homelessness. Housing is a basic human right that we in the richest country in the world are failing to provide for our veterans, for victims of domestic violence, for families with children, for people with disabilities, and for others who have fallen upon difficult circumstances. Today, over 500,000 of our neighbors are experiencing homelessness, and millions more are dangerously close to homelessness because they are unstably housed. That is why I introduced H.R. 1856, the Ending Homelessness Act of 2019, which is designed to provide the funding levels necessary to help every person experiencing homelessness rather than forcing us to make impossible decisions about whether to prioritize some people over others. Specifically, this bill would provide $13.2 billion in new mandatory funding over 5 years through targeted programs and initiatives in order to end homelessness in this country. H.R. 1856 provides $5 billion for McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Grant, $2 billion for special purpose housing choice vouchers, $5.25 billion for the Housing Trust Fund, $500 million for case management and social services, and $20 million for technical assistance for states and localities to help them integrate their health care and housing strategies. This funding is projected to ensure every person experiencing homelessness in America has a roof over their head, as well as access to the supportive services to stay housed. Now, I know that some will balk at the price tag and dismiss it outright, but I hope that this is not the case in this committee. Under Republican leadership, this committee considered proposals that would take the approach of diverting housing assistance to different subpopulations rather than providing sufficient funding to help everyone in need. While I disagreed with that approach, I fully agree with the intention behind those bills, and I appreciated that there was a recognition on both sides of the aisle that there are vulnerable people who are not getting the housing assistance they need. However, we will only solve this problem with new funding. Further, providing new funding is not only the right thing to do, but the most fiscally sound as well. When it comes to housing chronically homeless individuals, for example, multiple studies have shown that the cost to taxpayer for providing housing is significantly less than the long-term cost of allowing them to remain homeless and relying on other public services, such as emergency rooms. Los Angeles County's Project 50 found that permanent supporting housing yielded a net savings of $238,700 over 2 years, or $4,774 per occupied unit over 2 years. And similar results have been found in other major cities like New York, as well as smaller cities and rural areas across the country. Providing this funding is not only the morally right thing to do, it is the economically right thing as well. It is for these reasons that H.R. 1856 is widely supported by a broad coalition of advocates, public housing agency groups, as well as industry, and coalition groups that include developers, owners, and housing and supportive service providers. So please join me in supporting an end to homelessness in this country and vote yes on H.R. 1856, the Ending Homelessness Act of 2019. Is there a discussion of our amendments to H.R. 1856?
Move to strike the last word.
Ranking member?
I move to strike the last word.
Moves to strike the last word. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Waters. First, we all agree. Homelessness can and should be solved. I visited the Cleveland County Rescue Mission in Shelby, North Carolina last week in my district. I usually don't want to spend time talking about my district, but this is an example every member of this committee has in their district. A rescue mission that is taking folks off the street and giving them a place to get their mail, to get medical treatment, to have an address so they can even apply for a job. The basics, the absolute basics. On a cold night, they take men in, and it does even get cold in my district. Some of you may be surprised in North Carolina. But it helps them get to that first step off of the rawness of the streets. And if I ask my colleagues, hey, Mr. Sivers, thanks. If you can use your inside voice. Thank you, Steve. Call down. There are loud voices on both sides of the aisle, right? But this story is the same story every one of us have, of good people doing good work. And I talked to them about this very bill, $14 billion. The first thing they said to me is, we will not get a dime of it. Why? The grant writing process is such that you have to have a full-time person in order to write the grant and then to administer the grant. We have not fixed that in this bill. So papering this over with a lot of money does not actually get you what you want. The hard business of fixing this problem is fixing these programs and how to deliver it. That's the fundamental challenge here. It's not easy to fix this problem. In fact, our testimony when we had one hearing on ending homelessness said, quote, homelessness varies widely across communities and individuals, reducing the likelihood of a universal solution. Unfortunately, this bill provides for a universal solution that is not fitting for all the various states that are represented in this very diverse committee. So we need to have that flexibility. A program that may work in one community may not work in another. And our practitioners at the local level know how to do this. So let's give them those tools to do that good that we want them to do, to get to that first rung of getting folks off the streets and getting them into a sustainable situation. So, Chairwoman Waters, in 2016, you stated that localities don't know how to use federal funding. That's sort of my synopsis of your quote. You stated they, meaning Los Angeles, have a problem. They don't really know how to spend the money. I agree with you. This is the challenge. We need to make sure that localities have the optionality of programs that have been proven to work in the communities where they're in, the testing, the academic research, and then all the social research that goes into making sure we get delivery of services. This is an important issue. And you stated, Chairwoman Waters, in that same article, you acknowledged that, quote, this business of homelessness has evolved a lot over 15 years. It has to do with public policy, cost of housing, whether or not you're going to build more housing, end quote. I agree with you. The cost question here, which is local zoning ordinances or local building codes and the factors on the ground do matter. Your sincerity on this issue, I absolutely commend. And you have sincerely worked at this during your time in public service. And I commend you for that. I just wish we had a product here that was fitting, that we could achieve a bipartisan result so that we could see the idea into law. Instead, it's just going to be a partisan vote, and a partisan vote that will go nowhere in the Senate and not become law. So today is not about making a difference, it's about making a point. That's unfortunate. The legislating should be about making a difference for people's lives and getting outcomes. That's the amendments that Republicans will offer to fix this program, this idea, and make sure it's deliverable for people. Final thing, the cost question. At this rescue mission last week, they told me they want to serve 40 men on the first floor. They want to serve 40 more men on the second floor. But because of building codes and local ordinances, even in this town, that $1.2 million for that second floor, the cost structure added $250,000 to what they wanted to do. So that cost question is real. We need to address this in order to have a holistic approach to homelessness. Chairwoman Waters, I thank you and I commend you for your work on homelessness and your sincerity on this. And I hope you'll understand our sincerity on struggling with what we think is a good idea, but not properly crafted nor bipartisan legislation. I yield back.
Thank you.
Madam Chair.
For what purpose does the gentle lady from New York seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair Lady. I strongly support this bill, and I want to congratulate the chairwoman for her hard work on this issue, which is incredibly important to the district that I represent and to the city that I represent. According to HUD, in 2018, there were over 500,000 people experiencing homelessness in the U.S. on any given night, including nearly 160,000 children. Cities like New York already shoulder an immense financial obligation in funding programs to help the homeless improve their situations. New York City spends about $4.5 billion a year on homeless programs. So the additional federal money that this bill would provide would be enormously helpful to the city of New York and the people that live there. We badly need the funding and the strategies in this bill to effectively address the needs of the homeless in America. We know that the causes of homelessness in America are complex, but it's clear that the lack of affordable rental options for our lowest income families is an important factor. More than 70% of the lowest income renter households spend more than half of their income on rent and utilities, which makes the threat of homelessness a real possibility for far too many Americans. The chairwoman's bill would address this problem by including significant funding for the creation of a new permanent supportive housing and using accurate and reliable data to ensure that funding is available where it is needed most. Importantly, The bill would limit the amount that tenants have to pay in rent to 30% of their income under the Housing Trust Fund, which would greatly ease the financial burden on vulnerable families. I'm pleased to see that this bill would provide the necessary funding for outreach and case management, which would help connect homeless persons to the services they need to get back on their feet. This ensures that people who actually need help know what services are available to them and how to access them. After all, a program can only be as effective if it's actually reaching the people that it's designed to help. I want to thank Chair Lady Waters for the work that she's done on this bill. She has been fighting to end homelessness for years, literally from the day she walked into Congress. And I believe her bill will do just that. I urge my colleagues to support this bill and her efforts, and I yield back.
Madam Chair.
Is there further discussion
Move to
of
strike the last word.
amendments to H.R. 1856?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized, Mr. Duffy, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Welcome.
I host Homelessness and Hunger Summit every year in my district, and I would just note that homelessness...
Excuse me one moment, Mr. Duffy. Has the amendment been passed out?
I moved to strike the last word.
All right, thank you. All right, thank you very much.
It looks different in rural America, I know, than urban America, and it's just as painful, no matter where you live. But how we address homelessness in the different areas and population centers of the country is important. And a lot of the ideas that have come from my homelessness and hunger summits have not necessarily been addressed in this underlying bill. I would have hoped that we could have worked together in a bipartisan fashion, trying to come together as a Congress to address this issue, where we all wouldn't have gotten what we wanted, but we all could have come together in a bipartisan fashion, which gives us a better chance of passing a bill in the Senate and getting a signature from the White House. But with that said, a couple of concerns that I have. If you look at homelessness, I think we can maybe look to 3 different areas in which homelessness comes from. One, we have economics. People lose their job or don't make enough money. Number 1. Number 2, we have mental illness. And number 3, we have addiction. If you look at the economics, I mean, we have done a remarkable job over the last 2.5 years of exploding this economy. There are more jobs available than we have people to actually fill the jobs, which is great if we're trying to put money in the pockets of families so they can afford to get a home, a roof over their head. Not only that, there's so much competition for labor that wages are rising. So the economic side, we've improved dramatically with free market principles. By streamlining the tax code, with streamlining rules and regulations, you've seen amazing growth in America, which helps families who are on the cusp of homelessness or in suffering homelessness to actually get themselves out. On the addiction side, I got to tell you, as later today, we're going to have a debate about marijuana. Homelessness and addiction are closely tied together. Why do we want to support legalizing marijuana that puts us on a pathway to other drugs when we know there's a direct tie-in with drug use and homelessness? I think we should be looking at this completely differently. I don't think we're helping the homeless by saying we should, support drug legalization. I think we need to do the exact opposite. I think we're missing the boat on that. I mean, we're talking out of both, not we, those who authored the bill and bills are talking out of both sides of their mouth. You can't say, I support legalizing drugs, but then recognize that addiction is a key component to homelessness. It just doesn't match up. And I don't know how folks can, wrap their head around that. The final thing is there's an affordability issue that drives the cost of housing. And we should really be looking at, and it does come from my good friends in New York and California, but this is all over the country. We had a hearing in the last Congress where the home builders, I think, indicated that 30%, and I think that the ranking member mentioned this, 30% of the cost of housing is from zoning rules and ordinances. And I believe that there's good ordinances and good rules. As we've dealt with flood with my friends across the aisle, we want to make sure that there's good rules in place if you're building in risky areas. That's a good thing. But when you look at 30% of the cost of a home or the fees that are charged in housing, you're pricing people out of the ability to purchase a home and putting them on the street because of idiotic, stupid rules that come from government. So government is part of the cause of this. If we could actually streamline the rules and regulations and drop the cost of housing by 30%, we do wonders to make housing affordable for so many more Americans. And you marry that up with the great economic boom we have in this country, and we are making this country great again, Madam Chair. Making housing affordable again. And I think instead of putting up the aircraft carrier, which is spending is part of this. It is. Making programs work better is part of it. And thinking through the policies that drive up the cost of housing for our constituents is part of it as well. And I think that could be a broader conversation that we could have had in a bipartisan fashion that I think could have led to a bipartisan bill, and we could have hopefully got it passed and make people's lives better. However, when it comes out just one side, I think it makes it that much more challenging to get a bill passed. And I hope as we move through the amendment process, but also future legislation, we can work together to improve the lives of those who struggle in America. With that, I yield back.
Thank you very much.
Madam Chair.
I think the gentleman from Wisconsin confuses this bill with the cannabis bill. For what purpose does the gentleman from Missouri seek recognition?
I move to strike the last one.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for introducing the bill. And I also share your commitment to finally confronting our nation's shameful failure to end homelessness. It is a stain on our nation's great history that even in 2019, an estimated 1.5 million Americans are homeless. This is unacceptable in the richest country in the world, with a billionaire as head of its government. To add insult to injury, 22% of the homeless population are children, and looking at the racial data is even more discouraging, as an estimated 42% of the homeless population are African Americans. And there are an estimated 40,000 homeless veterans in HUD's 2018 point-in-time count. To go across oceans to fight for your country but then get tossed aside is shameful and just plain wrong. In my state of Missouri alone, there are over 6,000 people living in transitional housing, unsheltered, or in emergency shelters, and this must end. The bill, which would appropriate over $13 billion in mandatory funding over 5 years, is a good start. But I want to stress that the Housing Subcommittee will continue to exercise vigorous oversight of the HUD programs and policies which affect housing and homelessness. So going forward, I look forward to working with members on both sides of the aisle in this committee as we continue to work to end homelessness. And Madam Chair, I yield back.
Is there further discussion?
Madam Chair.
Mr. Stivers? Are you ready?
Madam Chair.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Ohio seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I move to amend. It's amendment, is there a number on here or something?
You have an amendment at the
Number
desk?
1, Stivers Amendment number 1.
You have an amendment number
Yes, I
1
have
at the
amendment
desk?
at the desk.
We will pause to allow copies of the amendment to be distributed. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's just a tiny amendment.
Do they know what the amendment is? The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1856, offered by Mr. Stivers of Ohio. At the end of the bill, add the following new section. Section 9, definition of homeless children. A, in general, the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act is amended. 1, in Section 103, 42 U.S. Code 11302. A, in Section A, 1, in paragraph 5.
Madam Chair, I ask unanimous consent that the amendment be considered read.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of the amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate the chairwoman's passion and sincere dedication to combat homelessness. You'll note from what was read of the amendment that this is eerily similar to the conversation we had during the committee's taking up the views and estimates of the budget, and an amendment that asked for harmonization of the definitions between the Housing and Urban Development Department and the Education Department was included in those views and estimates, and with the chairwoman's support and the support of the majority. I understand this is a big amendment, and we tried to work with the chairwoman's office, and I think we had some snafus on that over the weekend, which I want to personally apologize for. It is not my intention to ambush anyone. It is not my intention to surprise anyone. This is something I've worked on for a long time and want to try to get to an answer on, and I'll just summarize the problem. The problem is that the Department of Housing and Urban Development's definition of homelessness excludes anybody under the age of 18, and therefore the ability to get federal dollars to address their homelessness is not allowed. There have been some demonstration programs, including in Columbus, Ohio, that Congresswoman Beatty and I have been very supportive of to try to deal with this, but the fundamental problem is the definitions of homelessness at HUD and at the Department of Education are not harmonized. In my home state of Ohio, the Department of Education statistics released in February said there were 30,385 homeless K through 12 students in Ohio. That was a 39% increase. And the National Network for Youth says there is no real solid national figure because, you know, they're episodic counts at a point in time. There's no real understanding of what the number is. I've heard some people say 4 million homeless youth. You know, the studies I've looked at say about 1.2 million homeless youth. If you take this 30,000 number and divide by, Ohio's about 3.6% of the nation's population, that would be less than 1 million homeless youth. I don't know what the answer is. I know there are homeless youth that need help today. I want to try to help them. I would really like to work with the chairwoman and the committee to try to deal with this problem, whether it's today or some other time, because it's important and there's real people suffering. And these are folks who are among the most vulnerable population that can be homeless. And some are couch surfing, some are staying with friends, some are forced into a position of staying with people that are not looking out for their best interest. And many of us, including I, have fought to stop family separation at the border, but we're allowing family separation in the homelessness arena because children aren't considered homeless. And I know everybody here, Republican and Democrat, cares about kids and cares about families. I just want you to know I have a sincere interest in working on this issue. I'm offering this amendment in good faith. I understand it's not small, but it is the same thing we've been working on for a number of years to try to harmonize the definitions between HUD and the Department of Education. And last year, a lady named Kat Lilly, who was a single mom who struggled to find shelter for her family, spoke to this, I guess the subcommittee, about how the HUD's definition of homelessness, she felt like hurt her kids and kids especially with special needs, and she had a couple of them. I would urge that the committee work together. I will work with folks in good faith. If you don't feel like, if you feel like it's too much today, I'll work with you. But I want you to know from my heart, there is a sincere interest in fixing this problem to help up to 1 million to 4 million kids in this country. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Chairman, Chair Lady.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stivers. I sincerely appreciate your efforts on this amendment and your sincere interest. And I don't think we're ready to come to an agreement yet, but I will commit to working with you on an amendment that we can accept when this goes to the floor. We're in alignment on the goals, so I think we should be able to reach an agreement here. So will you please withdraw your amendment in good faith, the good faith effort to work with us on expanding eligibility for homeless children and youth?
Madam Chair, may I ask one question? If that includes harmonizing the definitions, absolutely.
That is our goal.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I would move to withdraw my amendment.
Thank you very much.
Madam Chair.
Without objection, such is the order.
Madam Chair,
We're
Lady.
seeking recognition.
Gentleman,
the gentleman from Georgia is seeking recognition. You're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I think Mr. Stivers and our friends on the Republican side are very genuine in wanting to come together and work on this problem. But the way you want to start that is to let's start with not cluttering up this Mr. Waters' homelessness bill with other issues. But let's point to and resolve the issues that are at hand. Now, I want to start by going back to, I wanted my remarks to really cover the bill itself because so much has been made. And if I may go to Ranking Member McHenry's point and other points that have been brought up about this issue of cost. I want to make sure that Ms. Waters didn't just go out and pull out some figure to say this is what it's going to cost. She got the experts. She got the people who have been working on this issue, as she has, for years. This is what it takes. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I just recall to our remembrance what happened in other crises that impacted this country. You can go all the way back to the Civil War, when the North and the South and all of this nation was in great destruction. But you know what? When Abraham Lincoln and General Lee were standing right over in that Capitol, it was busted up. And President Lincoln said, "It is not incumbent for us to complete this task of rebuilding the nation." But Lee interrupted him and said, "Mr. President, neither are we free to desist from doing all we possibly can, spending the necessary money." And that's what brought this nation together. Franklin Delano Roosevelt did the same thing in the Depression. And many of us were here when we had the Wall Street fallout and the financial problems that happened. Paulson came over here. We didn't hassle. We got the experts together. This is what it's going to cost. We got to do the same thing with this issue. Ms. Waters has done the necessary research. We brought the experts in, and this is what it's going to cost. Finally, there are 3 things that we must do to deal with this homelessness. One is we got to coordinate and pull together all the diverse agencies that are out there that are dealing with it. Coordination. Secondly, we've got to make sure the money's there, that the funding is there. And then, ladies and gentlemen, we've got to go to work and find some answers as to why one race of people, African American people, who make up only 13% of this nation's population, yet results in they are 40%, almost half, of the homelessness population. And our veterans who are committing suicide, many because they're losing their homes. And they're committing suicide 20 every day. This bill addresses all of that, brings the VA in, brings HUD in. So I want my Republican friends to understand that it's going to take the same kind of energy that Abraham Lincoln and Robert E. Lee put together, that Franklin Delano Roosevelt put together, and that many of you who are on this committee put together, and we came out of the Wall Street financial disaster. So I am just asking that we move forthrightly, Democrats and Republicans together, and I respect you, Mr. Stivers, for agreeing to remove your amendment. And let us give the issue of homelessness and our chair lady, Ms. Waters, the respect that both of these deserve. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Madam Chair.
Reserves.
Madam Chair.
Who seeks recognition? Is it on this side?
Adams.
Which one?
Yeah, I move to strike the last word, Madam Chair.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Nobody from our side.
Who was it? It's on this side? I think Mr. Heck is next. Is that right? Yes. Thank you.
Yes, it is. Thank you, Madam Chair.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Move to strike the last word. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm highly motivated and delighted to be able to add my voice and my vote in support of the Ending Homelessness Act, and also have this opportunity perhaps to set the record a little bit straight. Some of the remarks made previously by my good friend from Wisconsin, who reminds me of, as you all know, I'm fond of quoting Mark Twain, and one of the wisest, most enduring things he once said is, It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. And there were a couple of things asserted that just ain't so. Now, I'm not interested in relitigating his worldview of reefer madness, but it is important to note that there's absolutely nothing in the bill that he will speak against later that does anything to legalize marijuana, period, full stop. In fact, however, 47 states have already done that, including his own, who have, in fact, legalized medical marijuana, and who, in the most recent election, overwhelmingly, in a non-binding vote, supported adult recreational use.
Will the gentleman
also think, no, I won't yield. Also think it's important that while he indicated that lack of available affordable housing and wages to access them is true, his statement that wages have gone up dramatically, quote, end quote, is categorically untrue. And if it even were, it would have to overcome 30 years of basically stagnant wage growth in this country. Now, I support this bill, frankly, for two very important reasons. The first of which is, and again, my friend from Wisconsin did say some things that were important and true, namely affordability and mental health issues and substance abuse issues are material contributors to homelessness. And here's the fact, this is truth. You can't solve anybody's problem in anybody's life if they're sleeping under a bridge in the back seat of the car. If they're having a problem finding a job, they need pillow blanket roof, a pillow to lay their head on, a blanket to put under their body, and a roof over their head. If they're struggling with mental health, you're not going to solve that if they're sleeping under a bridge. If they've got an addiction problem, you're not going to solve that if they're sleeping under a bridge. So the importance of solving homelessness is that it is the predicate for solving the other challenges that confront people, including those identified by my friend from Wisconsin. Secondly, I support this bill because we have an overall housing shortage in this country, but it is acute and it is most painful on the end of the socioeconomic spectrum that yields homelessness and that compounds all the rest of the problems in people's lives. Truth is, after examining the housing market over the last couple of years, it's pretty clear that the high end of the market needs are being met, but that's about where it ends. It is some combination of shortage of land or lending or labor that contributes to this. But the fact of the matter is, we're not building starter homes in this country by and large. Now, what's the implication of that? No starter homes. It means people stay renting. And what happens then? It means occupancies go up. What happens then? That means they become more rent burdened at the same time that their wages aren't growing. That means more people qualify for public subsidy. That means more people end up being homeless. And so we've had a good... For somebody who talked about using an inside voice, Mr. McHenry, so homelessness is exacerbated very considerably by a failure of the market to provide adequate market rate housing, especially at the starter level. I've had extensive conversations with the chair. I'm very grateful for her indication. She acknowledges this, and that at some point, as the Committee of Jurisdiction for Housing, we might have an opportunity to talk about the other factors that contribute to and that actually increase homelessness among people, because the truth is we won't ever completely solve it unless we look at this from a whole cloth standpoint. So we need to get to that piece of our work. In the meantime, there are 550,000 people homeless every night. And just to close this up, where I began on the issue of reefer madness, I'd like to point out that once every 2 minutes in this country, every 2 minutes, a law enforcement officer is called into a home where there's domestic violence that's caused by alcohol. And not once have I had any of my friends and my relatives who are cops say, I had to go to a home to break up a fight because some guy got lit up on weed. Not one time. And yet we're not talking about alcohol abuse in here and how it relates to all the other problems confronting us. So let's keep it real. With that, I yield back.
I have an amendment at the desk.
Gentleman is recognized.
Are we debating the bill, Madam Chair? Or are we? I have an amendment at the desk.
you have an amendment at the? Mr. Duffy, we are still debating your bill.
No. I haven't introduced. I'd like to do Duffy 2 right now. We haven't done that yet. If I could have that read, it's at the desk.
You do have an amendment?
I do have an amendment at the desk.
So allow copies of the amendment to be distributed. So we talked about.
Madam Chair, I reserve a point of order against this amendment.
A point of order has been reserved. The chair recognizes the sponsor to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm not going to go back to the gentleman from Washington, my good friend who we've worked together on a lot of issues. I've never watched Reefer Madness. I think I've Cheech and Chong, maybe, Fast Times at Ridgemont High, Dazed and Confused, all the same theme with, I think, the same results. One maybe other quick point. The failure of the market, I would agree with the gentleman. I think he's right. There's a partial market failure, but there's also a government problem when we drive up the cost of housing for people who we could get into homes that are priced out because of needless, useless bureaucracy. But that's not my amendment. This is an amendment that we had great bipartisan support in the last Congress, 10 Democrat co-sponsors, 2 from this committee, well, I should say 1 from this committee, but Ms. Moore, who used to be on the committee, now is moved over to Ways and Means. We're all supporters. But this is a real simple idea, and it came from Mr. Turner from Ohio, who brought this to my attention. But when we have kids who age out of foster care, the rate of homelessness for those kids is incredibly high. Now, in half the states, you can age out at 18. In the other states, you can age out at 21. But regardless of when you age out, foster care, more than 2 in 5 youth endure housing challenges during the 2 years after they exit foster care. And 20% of our youth in foster care are at one point struggling through chronic homelessness. This is a huge problem for us. Studies show that the sudden and permanent transition from foster care to adulthood is oftentimes a key driver of homelessness. And because, I mean, if you think of this, the government takes the role of the parent of these youth. And it also determines when they age out of foster care. And it's, I think, our responsibility then to look at how do we help these kids transition from foster care into adulthood and not just cast them out onto the streets. Unfortunately, foster care alumni are one of the most vulnerable and high-risk groups when it comes to homelessness. And so I look at if we're trying to, save some money and prevent people from going into homelessness and the lifelong issues that creates, let's stop it before it happens. And that's what we're trying to do here. So this legislation increases access to housing for youth aging out of foster care by prioritizing minors who are aging out of the foster care program or a foster care program and at risk of homelessness when we furnish housing assistance. And so this amendment has a two-pronged approach that requires no actually additional spending. So number one, we would allow for early application. Minors would be able to apply for housing assistance upon reaching the age of 16 years old, number one. And number two, we give a priority preference. So 6 months prior to aging out of foster care, youth will automatically receive a top 3 priority preference for housing assistance. And Mr. Stivers is still talking loud, making it challenging to make my point.
3 strikes and you're out. Yes, sir.
Why don't I share the mic, Mr. Stivers? But also there's another requirement here in the 30 months as you go from foster care into assistance with housing. You have to pursue further education, such as a high school or college or a technical degree, engage in a workforce development program or vocational training, or participate in HUD's Family Self-Sufficiency Program. And employment can also be used to satisfy the active engagement requirement. So not only are we helping young people with the transition from foster care into adulthood, providing a roof over their head in an incredibly risky group here, but we also make sure they're doing the things that are necessary to be successful in life. They're continuing their education, they're getting a vocation, or they're working, all really positive developments. And so I've watched this aircraft carrier for $13 billion pop up on the screen, and I've said it many times, that is a lovely, beautiful sight of freedom right there. But maybe what we could do is put a little dinghy in the water. Put a little dinghy in the water after that aircraft carrier, Madam Chair, for those kids who are in foster care. Give them a little life raft and help them be successful as they move from foster care to adulthood. Let's not cast them out. Let's cast some love their way and help them stay in a house, roof over their head, and off the streets. With that, I yield back.
Madam.
The gentleman yields back without objection. The amendment will be considered as read. Does the gentlewoman insist on the point of order, wish to withdraw it?
I insist on my point of order, and I welcome his concern about foster children.
The gentlewoman has made a point.
But the amendment is not germane because the amendment addresses a subject matter outside the scope of this pending bill under Clause 7 of Rule 16 of the House of Representatives.
I'd like to be heard on the point of order.
The gentlewoman has made a point of order that the proposed amendment is not germane. Does any member wish to be heard on the point of order?
I do.
Mr. Duffy, the gentleman is recognized. On the point of order.
I would just argue, Madam Chair, that you have a homelessness bill. And I'm talking about kids that are falling into homelessness that are a certain subset of people that go from foster care into adulthood. And I'm talking about prioritizing them, which is definitely within the scope of this bill. And I don't know why my good friend from New York wouldn't say we care about kids, and to try to kick this amendment out, to not debate it and talk about it is troubling. Let's care about the kids. Rule in our favor, Madam Chair.
Does the gentleman yield back?
I do.
The chair is prepared to rule on the point of order. The gentlewoman from New York makes a point of order that the amendment proposed to this section is not germane. Clause section of the Rule 16, the germaneous rule provides that no proposition on a subject different from that under consideration shall be admitted under color of amendment. One of the central tenets of germaneness is that an amendment may not contain material that is outside the scope of the pending legislation. Here, the amendment in part contains material that is outside the scope of pending legislation.
Madam Chair. Madam Chair. Could I inquire of the chair? I understand.
Does the gentleman wish to be heard?
I understand the chairwoman's ruling. I would just ask that as this comes to the floor, if we could work together on my amendment and its germaneness to make sure we could address this issue on the floor, I'd be very grateful for that.
The chair is always willing to work with the member from either side of the aisle to see if we can come to an agreement.
That's very kind. Thank you.
Is there further discussion
Madam Chair.
of or amendments to H.R. 1856?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment.
The gentleman, Mr. McAdams, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move to strike the last word. Madam Chair, I first want to thank you for bringing up this important legislation. On any given night, nearly 3,000 Utahns, like many others around the country, are homeless. And I personally worked on homelessness issues when I was the mayor of Salt Lake County, so I know the dire situation, how dire the situation is for so many of our communities. I also know and gathered from this experience the value of working across the aisle to address these problems in a bipartisan fashion. Salt Lake County, like many urban areas, has struggled to understand and address the homelessness challenge, which is incredibly complex. And even though our metro area has recovered from the economic hardship of the Great Recession, other factors like an opioid epidemic have meant that thousands of Utahns live on the streets without a safe, stable place to call home. And many of these families with children are homeless youth. So I'm sensitive and compelled by some of the points that are being raised today. I believe it's unacceptable that the only home for a young child is the family car or a homeless shelter, or that a teenager is forced to couch surf with friends or relatives while trying to go to school or train for a job, many of whom have aged out of the foster care system. And this legislation before us includes a number of provisions that are important to help to address the homelessness situation. And the bill would provide resources, for example, to the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Grant Program, would fund new housing choice vouchers, and leverage funding through the Housing Trust Fund. Importantly, I also appreciate that this legislation recognizes the need to provide holistic wraparound services to address the root cause of homelessness and not just the symptoms. And the bill does this through a competitive grant program for states and local jurisdictions to provide case management and social services to individuals who are experiencing homelessness. And honestly, I believe that the issue of homelessness has been neglected historically at the federal level, and our communities are feeling this neglect. I also believe that it is our responsibility to address these priorities in a fiscally responsible manner and to make those tough budget choices. So to my colleagues across the aisle, I just want to say that I hear you, and I hear your concerns, and I do believe the chair wants to move forward this legislation in a bipartisan way and see it ultimately become law. As the bill moves to the floor, I would urge all sides to continue to work together to see if we can't move forward in a bipartisan fashion so it does become law, and so we can provide the support to homeless individuals in each of our communities and provide the support that they so desperately need. So thank you, Madam Chair, for your commitment to addressing homelessness in America, and I look forward to working with you and the committee to do just that. I yield back. Madam Chair, I have an amendment.
For what purpose does the gentleman from West Virginia seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
Without objection, the amendment we will pause to allow the copies of the amendment to be distributed. That's my fault. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1856, offered by Mr. Mooney. Page 4, after line 10, insert the following. Such formula shall provide that not less than 35% of any grant amounts
Move we consider the amendment read.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes. And from West Virginia, Mr. Mooney.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Appreciate that courtesy, and I'm here to speak on behalf of this amendment. At our organizational hearing in this committee, I actually specifically asked about the definition of diversity, because I'm on the diversity subcommittee also, and I specifically asked, are rural areas considered something we're going to be concerned about when it comes to diversity? And I was told that it would be. So my amendment simply addresses that. This amendment requires that 35% of the funds made available under this bill are dedicated to grant recipients serving in rural areas. The chairwoman said at the beginning that she's focused on fairness here in this committee, and I applaud that. I certainly am focused on fairness too. And in that definition, I just want to make sure that rural areas are included in the fair treatment. So some facts about why my amendment, I think, fits to this bill and is appropriate. The underlying bill makes more than $13 billion in new federal spending available for homeless assistance programs. That includes $5 billion in formula grants to address unmet needs of the homeless through permanent housing, $5 billion in the Housing Trust Fund to increase and preserve the supply of rental housing, and $2.5 billion in rental assistance vouchers. And I've seen the statistics. We all agree that homelessness is estimated at 550,000 people experience homelessness. It's probably low, frankly. But the bill makes no provision to ensure an equitable distribution of resources on a national basis. This is a national problem. It's not certain areas of our country. So my amendment simply ensures that 1/3 of all new resources dedicated to homeless assistance under the bill, more than $4.5 billion, are dedicated to our nation's rural communities. The amendment relies on current statutory definition of rural communities, which in some cases are fewer than 20,000 in population, and in all cases with fewer than 2,500 inhabitants. And I can tell you in the state of West Virginia, which is mountainous, we call it the hollers, people living in basically mountain and areas between mountains. That's what we have in West Virginia. I don't know how you can count that. I saw the statistic earlier where they estimated 1,243 homeless in my state of West Virginia. I can guarantee you that's low. It's hard to find these people. They're not easily seen when they're in mountainsides and in hillsides. Just some statistics to keep in mind. According to the Census Bureau, 60 million people, 1 in 5 Americans, live in rural America right now. Urban areas make up 3% of the entire land area of the country. So when you're talking land area and spotting people, it's just harder to spot them in the mountains. Some may perceive homelessness as a metropolitan issue, but it is not. It is rural, and in the rural areas, community and shelter resources are very limited. So I just think we need to experience it. I saw another statistic that 38,000 veterans are homeless, and I'm proud to say that West Virginia has the highest proportion of veterans in the country. 1 in 10 West Virginians have served in the military, and I'm proud to see that. But that again is rural areas, and these folks have served our country, and sometimes maybe they're proud and they may not go looking for assistance, but they need it and they deserve it. I actually had a meeting with veterans groups just last week when I was in the district, where I heard that statistic about 1 in 10 in my state. So this is a bipartisan issue, homelessness. I've been active on this issue throughout my career, and I applaud the intention of the bill. But I just ask that the committee not make it a regional issue, make it a national issue, and make sure rural areas are not overlooked, make sure they're included. And I urge the adoption of my amendment. And with that, I'm happy to yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much. I move to strike the last word. I certainly appreciate the gentleman's efforts on this amendment, and I agree that we need greater sensitivity and attention to rural housing issues. And I want you to know that I've worked with several members understanding some of the issues of concern, including everything from balloon payments, by some ways that loans are given in rural communities. This bill is already designed to provide housing for every person experiencing homelessness, including every person in rural areas. We are aware that the point in time count likely undercounts of people experiencing homelessness in rural areas. So the formula in the bill is specifically designed to look at structural determinants of homelessness, which should more than adequately capture the need across communities than the current 35%. This 35% is a very arbitrary portion that is not reflective of the need. It may be too little or it may be too much. In some, there's simply no reason to believe that rural areas would be overlooked by this bill. So I would urge my colleagues to vote no on this amendment and understand that the way the bill is constructed, that it may be even more than 35%. And so with that, I will yield back the balance of my time. Is there further debate on the amendment? If there is further debate on, Ms. Beatty, you're recognized for 5 minutes. You move to strike the last word.
Move to strike the last word. Thank you, Madam Chairperson. And to my colleague, I believe the question was posed to me in our meeting about diversity, including rural. And let me just assure you again, the answer is yes, as our chairwoman said. I guess my concern parallels with what the chairwoman said, because I also said in that same meeting that I didn't want us to play a numbers game. I didn't want to come here and define diversity by saying, and it's whether it's rural or whether it's African American or gender, that we did not want to do that. We want to diversify within the entities, whether it's government, whether it's now housing or anything, after we do a thorough review of it. And I think that you will be very pleased when we talk about veterans, when we talk about rural or inner cities, that the one thing I assure you is we're going to be fair. But I don't want to commit to a 35% or a 10% or a 50%, whether it's rural or inner city or suburban at this time. But again, I assure you, as it relates to D&I in the committee, we will be looking at diversity in a fair way. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Is there further debate on the amendment? If not, the question occurs on the amendment. All those in favor of the amendment say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, nay. In the opinion of the chair, the nays have it. The nays have it, and
Madam
the
Chair,
amendment is
ask
not
for a
agreed
recorded
upon.
vote.
For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
Ask for a recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested. All in favor of a recorded vote shall raise their hand and be counted. There is a sufficient second, and a recorded vote is so ordered. Pursuant to Section C5 of Rule 3 of the committee rules, the vote on this question is postponed. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Meeks, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Move to strike the last word.
Move to strike the last word. I just have to first compliment the chairwoman for her bill. I could not be as eloquent as Mr. Scott was when he brought the history of what's coming by and how the significance of what this bill is, with the experts coming in to talk about the tragedy of homelessness and even putting a dollar amount. How much is a life worth? You know, those of us, or many of us, just about everybody here is people of faith. We will be judged, ultimately, I believe, by what we do for the least of these. How do we take care of those who are less fortunate than us? Mr. Scott is absolutely right. There was no question about it when we thought that the financial system was going to go down, and those individuals who are multi-billionaires, we want to make sure that they were okay. We took care of them. Now we are talking about a scenario of taking care of the least of these. This is, as indicated by the chairwoman, the richest country in the world. How could we want to stand by and then start arguing over dollars in regards to taking care of a people who are less fortunate than us, with many different problems? I think it is incumbent upon us as a nation, all of us, to come together to make sure that we resolve that issue. And I would be remiss, you know, I keep looking at the sign that we come up, because when you talk about 40% of African Americans, 40% homeless and only 13% of the population. My dear colleagues, there is a reason for that. And it's about the ugly history in the United States of America. I would be remiss if I did not say it is that ugly history, from slavery to segregation to Jim Crowism. African Americans, by law, were prevented housing, jobs, health care, by law. And it's only been 156 years since slavery ended. We're not talking about 1,000 years ago. 156 years. My great-grandfather was a slave. Denied everything in this country. So you say 156 years? Well, let me tell you something. Jim Crow, segregation, voting rights, civil rights, that just ended in 1963. That's only 56 years ago. So do you think that we've remedied all of the problems of slavery in 56 years? No. When individuals have been denied and denied and denied by law, we've got a heck of a lot of work to do to resolve this issue. It is America's greatest sin. And we've yet to really confront it and face it. Here is an opportunity at least to make the first step so that we can, by first acknowledging that, which I don't think that we do too often in America, we will go and we'll talk all over the world for the ills any place else without facing our own ills. And we've got to face and confront that straight up. I can recall property that my parents wanted because my grandfather had, that was taken from them. Taken by law. I was with a friend of mine just the other day who was talking about her grandmother, who worked but was denied a pension because the category of work that she had as a housekeeper, they made sure that she could not get her pension. I could give hundreds of stories of how people were denied the right to accumulate wealth, businesses that were wiped out because of laws that prevented them from doing several things, and discrimination. This country, it attributes to that number of 40% of African Americans being homeless and only 13% of the population. So I think that we should do something, and I think that the chairwoman has gone beyond reason in trying to make sure everybody's included in this. She's tried to make sure that, she utilized all of the experts. She's tried to make sure that people can participate in this process so that we can end homeless, whether it's urban America, whether it's rural America, no matter where it is. So we should be complimenting her, coming together on this bill, and making sure we at least take the first step to end homeless in America.
Thank you. I move to strike the last word. We'll hear from Mr. Lodomick first. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
We'll pause to allow the copies of the amendment to be distributed.
Madam Chair?
The gentleman is recognized. I
just want to make one correction.
Yes.
I said 40% of the African American population. I didn't mean that. I meant that 40% of the homeless are African Americans. I just want that record to be clear.
Without objection, the correction is accepted. Thank you. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1856, offered by Mr. Loudermilk. Page 2, strike lines 23 through 25.
Move that the amendment be considered read.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of the amendment.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. I think we've had some vigorous debate in here. Before I get into the gist of my amendment, though, I think I want to make something clear, because there's been seems like some discussion from the other side very passionately, and I appreciate the passion that we do have for the things we believe in here. It seems to be some of the argument is that some on our side are not willing to move forward with this bill, or we're arguing over the money, or that's not the case that I've seen so far, nor the case that I see in these amendments. But homelessness is a problem. It's definitely a problem in our society. In Georgia, we have over 9,500 homeless, and many of those are veterans, which is something near and dear to my heart as a veteran as well. But what I'm looking at, and what my colleagues are looking at, is how can we actually do something to help with homelessness? And if we're going to move forward, what is the best thing that we can do? Our side, this has been a priority on our side. As you've heard already with Mr. Stivers and his bill regarding homeless children and his attempts to make some changes to this bill to address that. Mr. Duffy has had his housing choice vouchers bill. We've all heard it said many times that the best cure for poverty is a job. And we have created a robust economy where there is a surplus of jobs out there. None of these in itself is a cure for homelessness. And I support the intent of the bill, but I do have some significant concerns on the way the bill is crafted at this point, because if we're going to spend this amount of money, we have to make sure that the money that we spend to end homelessness is effective and efficient. And that is a huge challenge for big government bureaucracies, the effectiveness and efficiency. We need to make sure that the money is spent where we intend it to be spent, not on office furniture or elaborate furnishings or these ivory towers that we see here in Washington, D.C., or elaborate salaries for those who manage this. We need to make sure that those who need the support are getting the support. The slide that's been up on the screen compares the cost of an aircraft carrier of $13 billion. That being the cost, and then down at the bottom it says the cost to end homelessness is $13 billion. And this bill proposes $13.27 billion. And Madam Chair, if I thought that we could end homelessness in this nation by striking a check for $13 billion, I'm sure everybody on this committee would support that. But history has not proven that to be the case. In the history of our nation, since our war for independence, we have spent a total of $8 trillion on all the wars. We've been pretty successful there. $8 trillion on all wars since the beginning of our nation. Since President Johnson declared war on poverty in 1964, we have spent $23 trillion, and there is the same level of poverty today as there was then. So I don't believe just striking a check is going to actively end homelessness. So we need to make sure if we're going to spend this money, it needs to be spent effectively. Earlier today, the Oversight Subcommittee, we had a hearing to do some oversight and accountability on housing and urban development on the problems that they're having with disaster relief grants because it's not being spent effectively and efficiently. And that money is appropriated under the discretionary budget. We all here have been talking about oversight and accountability. That's something the American people are hearing from both sides. One of the problems I have with this bill is that this $13 billion is being spent under mandatory funding, which further separates it from the accountability and oversight of Congress. So the first thing that my amendment would do would move that under the appropriations process, under the discretionary budget, so that we do have the ability to go in and have proper oversight and accountability of the way the money is spent to ensure it gets to the people who need it. The second concern I have is the designation of emergency spending, and here's the problem we have with that. For a designation of emergency spending, the OMB says it must be necessary, sudden, urgent, unforeseen, and not permanent. It must be temporary. If it doesn't meet all of that criteria, then OMB is empowered to go cut spending somewhere else to fill this spending gap. We just voted on the floor a little while ago on a veto override because we were upset with the executive branch moving money around without congressional approval. Many in this room voted for that. This, by default, would give the the executive branch the power to move the money around. So with that, Madam Chair, I know I'm out of time. I urge the adoption of my amendment.
Thank you very much. I move to strike the last word. With over 500,000 people experiencing homelessness on our streets, I feel strongly that we cannot simply authorize funding and hope and pray for appropriations levels to reflect the bill. Homelessness has reached crisis levels in many parts of this country, and we need to take action now. Personally, I would like to say to all of the members, I'm sick and tired of hearing people talk about how terrible it is, how people are sleeping on the streets, how children are sleeping in cars, and yet many of them are getting up, going to school every morning. And I'm really sick and tired about people talking about how much they love our veterans and they want to do everything possible for them to have a decent quality of life. But yet, when it comes to spending money on them, the conversation changes. The mandatory nature of the spending in this bill is what makes it bold and meaningful. Does the gentleman plan to vote for this bill if his amendment is accepted? Or did the gentleman leave? Do you plan to vote for the bill if we accept your amendment?
Well, Madam Chair, that depends on other amendments, and we'll see when the final bill comes through, but it would definitely move me in that direction.
But what I'm asking is, if your amendment, you're very concerned about the issue in the way that you have described it, if your amendment is included in this bill, the question is, will you vote for the bill, or are you telling me you may or may not?
Well, Madam Chair, what I'm saying is this would give us the ability as Congress to have better oversight to ensure that the money is being spent more effectively. My decision on voting for the final package actually depends on what the final package is, which we won't determine until the other amendments are brought forward. But this definitely would move me in that direction.
Thank you. I'm committed to finding ways to pay for this bill. And I don't know whether the gentleman is offering this amendment in an effort to get to yes on the bill. I hear what you're saying. I'm not open to accepting this amendment at this point, and I urge my colleagues to vote no.
I'd like to strike the last word.
Is there further debate on this amendment?
I move to strike the last word.
Mr. Budd, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I want to offer my full support to, and I want to commend Mr. Louderbilk for his thoughtful amendment that he is offering here today. I think the underlying bill actually has problems. And while I commend its drafter and the lead sponsor for their motives, which are good, I just don't think this is the best approach to ending homelessness, which is a very multifaceted, and as my friend from West Virginia pointed out, it is a very regional problem. The bottom line is that it is currently written. The bill creates several new initiatives, but they have vague objectives and outcomes that would produce a huge increase in federal spending. I think at the very least, if we're going to vote on this bill, we should agree that it should be using money that has been actually authorized by Congress. That used to just be a no-brainer in this place. I hope this amendment strikes my colleagues as it did me, as a common sense idea. And once again, I want to thank Mr. Loudermilk and his team for catching this problem with the bill and for offering this very thoughtful amendment. I urge adoption, and I do yield back.
Is there further debate on the amendment? Mr. Foster, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Yeah, I move to strike the last word. There's sort of two arguments that we see again and again in this. One is that there just isn't enough money in this country. You know, that we've been debating this for the last, as long as I've been on this committee. And the second one is that the federal debt is too large. Now, there are numbers associated with both of those. If you ask, is there enough money in this country, the number for that is the net worth of American families, what's called household net worth. That currently sits at about $105 trillion. Not billion, trillion dollars. That is the net worth of American families. So what we're talking about spending on this bill is roughly 1/10,000th of that to cure homelessness in America. Okay, and so now just close your eyes and imagine how small 1/10,000th of anything is. The secondly has to do with, well, our government doesn't have enough money, that we're $20 trillion in debt, okay, which is 1/5 of the net worth of Americans. So that our net worth as a country, instead of being 100 trillion minus 20, is about 80 trillion. So that's the net worth of our country, including our government debt. And that, incidentally, is up by about 50 trillion from the depths of the recession. It went down to about 55 trillion. Household net worth went down to 55, and it's added about 50 trillion to that. Okay, so that is the scale of the money that's available in this country for whatever we choose. And so I think it's really important to bear that in mind. You know, it's not just aircraft carriers that compete for this money. And so when you're thinking about, is too much, is the debt too large, just those are the numbers associated with it. And when you go to sleep tonight and think about what it's like going to sleep without a roof over your head, or at one of the barely adequate shelters that I'm sure we've all visited. You know, think of that number, and maybe whether 1/10,000th of the net worth of American families is a reasonable number to spend on this.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes.
Yeah, I just want to clarify that my amendment doesn't deal with the amount of money spent, but just the mechanism of which we're spending it, to where if we are going to spend $13 billion, I feel it should be under the appropriations process, which gives Congress more authority, which our authority is somewhat limited already, but more authority to ensure that the money is spent effectively and efficiently, versus having our hands tied with it under the mandatory budget. That's the extent of my amendment, not arguing the amount, but the mechanism of which we are actually spending it.
Right.
Yield back.
Yeah, well, I thank you for that, and I think the relevant follow-up there is whether or not you think it's worth $13 billion to cure this problem. I think it's probably a little bit north of 13, honestly, but that this is the fundamental question we have to ask. I think we can get together on the mechanisms of oversight. You know, this is not all going to be spent perfectly, it never is, but if you go to a shelter and ask them the grants they've applied to and have been turned down because there wasn't enough money, you know, these organizations are not wasteful organizations. They're doing the best they can with the limited number of grants they can get, and putting a lot more money in the pot will help. And I think it'll be as well spent as any money that you can spend in America. Anyway, that was at this point. Any other comments? I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Is there further debate on the amendment? If not, the question occurs on the amendment. All those in favor of the amendment say aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. The nays have it. In the opinion of the chair, the nays have it, the nays have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. Yes.
Thanks for a recorded vote.
At this point, may request a recorded vote. Madam Chair, for what purpose? A recorded vote has been requested. All in favor of a recorded vote shall raise their hand and be counted. There is a sufficient second, and recorded vote is also ordered. Pursuant to Section C5 of Rule 3 of the committee rules, the vote on this question is postponed.
I have an amendment at the desk.
It's been recognized.
35.
The gentlelady, Ms. Adams, is being recognized for 5 minutes.
Move to strike the last word, Madam Chair.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to, first of all, applaud you on this bill. I'm happy to co-sponsor it. This is a serious problem. Homelessness is not a partisan issue. It's felt in every district, every county, and every state all over this nation. We've had a lot of amendments come through here. Some of them sound pretty good, you know, but we talk about the money that was spent and the huge increase in the deficit, but what about that tax giveaway? So we didn't have a problem with that. But let me just say that on any given night in my district, 5,100 people are experiencing sheltered homelessness, and 6,800 people are experiencing homelessness. More than 30% of the people in emergency shelter or transitional housing had experienced homelessness previously. In 2018, the UNC Charlotte Urban Institute conducted a report that revealed some key findings about housing instability in my district. And while these numbers are specific to District 12, I know that these issues are being felt in communities across the country. Number one, incomes have not kept pace with rents. In my district, an individual earning the minimum wage has to work 103 hours per week to afford a two-bedroom unit at fair market rent. And as you know, a typical work week is 80 hours. This is simply not a sustainable or fair model. Number two, the number of cost-burdened renters increased. In Mecklenburg County, 43% of renter households were cost-burdened in 2016. Now that translates to 75,930 renter households, up from 66,790 households in 2010. These families are at risk of losing their housing, and they may be forced to make trade-offs with other living expenses like medical care. So we're asking individuals and families to survive in a system that's built for them to fail. I want to applaud you, Madam Chair, for your bold and compassionate efforts to inject critical funding into our communities and into federal housing programs. I want to comment, Representative Meeks talked about what is expected of us. There are more than 3,000 references in the Bible that speak to how you treat the least of these. And if you're really interested, and if you're really concerned, and if you're truly committed to helping to solve this problem, you'll vote for this bill. And I urge my colleagues to support the bill. It is long overdue. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Is there a discussion of or amendments to H.R. 1856?
I have an amendment at the desk.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Wisconsin seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk, Madam Chair.
We will pause to allow copies of the amendment to be distributed.
Madam Chairwoman, I reserve a point of order against this amendment.
The gentlewoman from New York reserves a point of order. Where are we? Where are we? The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1856 offered by Mr. Duffy. Page 6, after line 19, insert the following. 5, promoting environmental justice requirement. In the case of any funds used for the acquisition, refurbishment, construction, or leasing of permanent housing, the Secretary shall ensure that each collaborative applicant that receives a grant under this section implements and will use such grant.
Wait, the reading, Madam
Without
Chair.
objection, the amendment will be considered as read. The gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized for 5 minutes in support of the amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We're having a conversation about homelessness and a conversation about money that it's going to cost to take people out of homelessness into homes. And the assessment is it's going to be $13 billion in change over 5 years. And I think Mr. Laudermill made a great point that we've spent trillions of dollars on the war on poverty and haven't really moved the needle. So I don't know if it's a money problem or if there's other problems we have to look at, which goes to the root cause of homelessness. But I would note that over 8 members of this committee have signed on to the Green New Deal. And the Green New Deal is one that if you're a rich liberal from maybe New York or California, it sounds great because you can afford to retrofit your home or build a new home that has zero emissions, that's energy efficient, affordable, and safe. Sounds really great. But when you can barely pay the rent or you can barely afford a mortgage,
to look at the cost increases that the Green New Deal will have on poor American families, it's absolutely outrageous. So HUD did a study, and if you're going to retrofit all of the HUD houses to match the Green New Deal standard, which again, over 8 of you have signed on to, it would cost anywhere between $66.5 billion to $172 billion. So you'll add no new housing to the stock, no new houses, you're just going to spend, what, at least 5 times your $13 billion number, 5 times your $13 billion number just to retrofit the existing stock. You won't put anybody else in a house, but you will spend $66 to $172 billion to retrofit American housing. It's outrageous. It's absolutely outrageous. And I don't know, maybe my friends across the aisle forgot to put this language in the underlying bill, but it is addressed in the Green New Deal that the chair signed on to. She's a co-sponsor of it. And so I ask, if you care about the poor, if you care about the homeless, shouldn't we make it more affordable for the poor and the homeless to get housing? Shouldn't we try to stretch our dollar further to get more people with a roof over their head? More people who are working, 2 parents that are working that have a couple of kids, make it more affordable for them to buy a house? This bill doesn't make it more affordable. It makes it less affordable. So I think it's rich that we talk about how we care about the poor, but all the while, we'll sign on to bills that dramatically increase the cost of a family to get into a home. Not only that, when we're looking at saying, how do we make housing more affordable? How do we stretch the dollar? You're going in the wrong direction with this bill. And that's not to say that we can't have a conversation about how do we do things more cleanly? How do we do things more efficiently? I'll have that conversation. But the legislation that the chair signed on to does the absolute exact opposite of that. And so I think we should not focus on the rich, wealthy elites who will look at this and go, I love it because I've got big money in the bank. Everyone should do this. We should all sign on to it. But if you're a poor family just trying to make ends meet, it's a horrible idea. It's kind of like saying, I'll sign on to the Green New Deal, but I'll take a private jet from DC to California, a private jet. Or I'll take my Uber SUV. I won't take the train. Or I'll go to Davos and fly my private jet. The hypocrisy. Or I'll stump for the 2016 candidate, and I'll demand private jets to fly me around the country, but then I'll come in and demand that every other American live by a certain set of standards that I don't abide by myself. And so I think we should be honest in this committee and say, let's drive down the cost of housing for Americans. And we can start by saying no to the Green New Deal, at least in the housing section, and we should take a hard look at the rules and regulations that drive up the cost of rental properties and homes that our families are going to buy that help them live the American dream. And we can push that on our states and our municipalities. And by driving down the cost of housing, making it more affordable, we help people take control of their own lives and get into houses. But what this committee has done is taken us in the wrong direction, a more expensive direction, a direction that doesn't stretch our dollar as far as it could go if we had a little bit of common sense. And so, Madam Chair, I bring this up because I'm going to vote against it. But I bring it up because I think we should debate it, because I think it's a horrible idea. And again, it doesn't help the poor. And so if you support it, you should vote for it. And you should not have a point of order. You should debate it, you should discuss it, and if you like it, and you want to jump the cost of housing, you should vote for it. With that, I am going to vote no, because I think it's a bad idea and hurts the poorest among us. I yield back.
Does the gentlelady from New York seek recognition?
I do, Madam Chairwoman.
The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I am very encouraged by the sudden concern on the other side of the aisle about climate change, and it makes me feel as though our efforts have been effective, at the very least, in distancing between the dangerous strategy of climate denial, which we know is costing us lives, at least 3,000 Americans in Puerto Rico in Hurricane Maria. But aside from that, when we talk about the concern of the environment as an elitist concern, 1 year ago, I was waitressing in a taco shop in downtown Manhattan. I just got health insurance for the first time a month ago. This is not an elitist issue. This is a quality of life issue. You want to tell people that their concern and their desire for clean air and clean water is elitist? Tell that to the kids in the South Bronx, which are suffering from the highest rates of childhood asthma in the country. Tell that to the families in Flint, whose kids have their blood is ascending in lead levels. Their brains are damaged for the rest of their lives. Call them elitist. You're telling them that those kids are trying to get on a plane to Davos? People are dying. They are dying. And the response across the other side of the aisle is to introduce an amendment 5 minutes before a hearing in a markup. This is serious. This should not be a partisan issue. This is about our constituents in all of our lives. Iowa, Nebraska, broad swaths of the Midwest are drowning right now, underwater. Farms, towns that will never be recovered and never come back. And we're here, and people are more concerned about helping oil companies than helping their own families? I don't think so. I don't think so. This is about our lives. This is about American lives. And it should not be partisan. Science should not be partisan. We are facing a national crisis. And if we do not ascend to that crisis, if we do not ascend to the levels in which we were threatened at the Great Depression, when we were threatened in World War II, if we do not ascend to those levels, if we tell the American public that we are more willing to invest and bail out big banks than we are willing to invest in our farmers and our urban families, then I don't know what we're here doing. I don't know what we're here doing. So I welcome the sudden enthusiasm to address the climate. And in that spirit, I want to reach my hand across the aisle and say, let's do a hearing. Let's do a hearing on environment and housing. And I'm happy to do that, and I'm happy to bring forth and entertain that provision of the bill. Thank you very much. I yield my time.
Would the gentlelady yield?
Madam Chair, move to strike the last word.
Will the gentlelady yield is the question.
Yes, I'll yield.
And Mr. Hill has asked for the gentlelady.
Mr. Barr. Mr. Barr. Yes.
Oh, Mr. Barr has excuse me before.
Yes.
The ranking member.
I'm asking if the gentlelady from New York would yield.
Yes, just one moment. The ranking member has asked for recognition. Are you asking the gentlelady to yield?
No, I thought she had yielded back and therefore is asking for time.
No, then I will recognize the gentleman, Mr. Barr, who's asking the gentlelady to yield. Does the gentlelady from New York yield?
Yes, I'll yield.
The gentlelady yields.
Thank you, and I appreciate the gentlelady from New York's passion about the issue, and I think it's genuine. I think it's heartfelt. And I also appreciate her passion for working Americans and the need to provide for a future of prosperity for working Americans. And I want to invite the gentlelady to come to Eastern Kentucky, my home area, where thousands of coal miners no longer have paychecks. I invite her to go underground with me and meet the men and women who do heroic work to power the American economy. And I would invite the gentlelady to come to Eastern Kentucky and meet the coal miners who will tell you what the Green New Deal would mean for their families, their paychecks.
With respect, I reclaim my time. I'd be happy to. In fact, when I first started my campaign, the first place I went to was to Kentucky, and I sat and I drove from the airport to where we were staying with an individual, and he was telling me his story. I'd be happy to go to Kentucky. Good. And I'd also like to note that in the Green New Deal, one of the things that I advocate for is fully funding the pensions of coal miners in West Virginia and throughout Appalachia, because we want a just transition to make sure that we're investing in jobs across those swaths of the country. Thank you very much.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Is there further debate on the amendment?
Strike the last word.
Mr. McHenry strikes the last word. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
All right, thank you. I rise to speak on this amendment. So let's take a deep breath. I raised early on, and Republicans on this side of the aisle in the hearing about homelessness raised the question of cost. This amendment is about cost. your side of the aisle, and I quoted Chairwoman Waters, she too has concerns about cost. And as I pointed out, the bill does nothing on cost. So, but I expressed that Chairwoman Waters is concerned, as we are, on cost. However, the legislation does not address that. So what I raised today with this amendment and the larger discussion about this document called the Green New Deal is the question of cost and the affordability, the fundamental affordability. By one analysis, that legislation called the Green New Deal would result in housing per unit going up. In order to retrofit existing units, as it calls for, it would go up between $13,000 and $35,000. If you go to zero admission standards, which I think is laudatory, absolutely laudatory, it would cost $35,000 per housing unit. Now, I say this as somebody who acknowledges that man has had impact on our climate. I represent the Blue Ridge Mountains of Western North Carolina. We love having a clean environment. It is a part of our economy and our economic growth, our clean air, our clean water, the beautiful nature of our district, or our area. So I do care about the environment. I do think having goals is laudatory. I also think the fundamental question of price and affordability is fundamental to the discussion of homelessness and getting access to stable housing. I do think that offering of the Green New Deal, a serious policy offering, is so detrimental to that fundamental functioning of our economy that it would be debilitating to our existing housing stock. Much less the question of families accessing a home for the first time, much less that transitional housing and the cost for transitional housing, and it is devastating in its consequence for those that are on the margins. I care about a clean environment, absolutely, absolutely. And I've been working on policies in order to help clean our environment and do the fundamental things to stop the devastating effects of climate change on our people. But the cost structure is what we're debating right now. So let's lower the decibels. Let's have substantive debate on the contents of this offering.
Would the gentleman yield?
With that, yes, happy to yield to my colleague from Wisconsin.
Thank you. And I think to underscore your point, the gentlelady from New York talked about the quality of life. And if you increase the cost of houses in America or rental properties in America, that diminishes the quality of life because you end up homeless. You can't put a roof over your head. So the quality of life with this legislation actually goes down because you can't afford a home. When we reference farmers, I come from America's dairyland. We have a lot of cows. The Green New Deal doesn't see a future in America with cows. That's significant for my people, for my farmers.
Would you like to?
So investing in farmers, maybe you're investing in farmers that aren't dairy farmers.
Would you yield your time?
But farmers in Wisconsin won't survive.
Reclaiming
and I would
my
just,
time.
Could I just make one last point?
Sure, reclaiming my
The time
time.
belongs to Mr. McHenry.
I'll yield to my colleague from New York.
Mr. Lee?
No.
Who is he?
Ms. Cortez, who asked for me to yield.
Well, I'll actually yield back. Sorry about that. There's just 30 seconds left. So.
30 seconds. Mr. Duffy.
Thank you. And I would just note that I offered this amendment during views and estimates. And those who are so passionate about the Green New Deal all voted down the Green New Deal amendment that I offered. So you're already on the record saying no because you understand the cost is so great. And I'd also note that in the Senate today, the Green New Deal is coming up for a vote, and I believe even the presidential candidates are going to be voting present because they know it's going to be very costly for America. So if you believe that the Green New Deal saves lives, vote yes. If you believe that the Green New Deal hurts the homeless, vote no.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Madam Chair, move to strike the last word.
Is there further debate on the amendment?
Madam Chair, move to strike the last word. Mr. Nicholas from Guam.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You know, I'm sitting here, we're discussing an amendment that even the mover isn't going to be voting for, just so we can all argue about something that's completely germane to the bill that we're trying to address here. This is the kind of stuff, this is the kind of politics that really disgusts America. Our people want us to get to work and focus on the issues. They don't want us to be jumping back and forth and arguing stuff that's completely irrelevant to the measure that we're trying to debate here. So, you know, I liked some of the previous amendments that the other side of the aisle proffered. I was actually considering supporting some of them, but when we're going to be, you know, doing these kind of antics, this is the kind of stuff that the American people do not want to see their government doing. If we're going to be talking about homelessness and trying to fund it and trying to solve it, let's not introduce something to just spin this into a Green New Deal punching bag. I mean, it's just not what the American people want us to be doing. And so I humbly ask all of my colleagues to please stay focused on the issue that we're addressing and for us not to be entertaining these kind of amendments. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
Move to strike the last word.
The gentleman, Mr. Heisinger, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate it. And I appreciate the comments of my colleague. The interesting thing is that this is as relevant as talking about the costs of building code. This is as relevant as what our ranking member in the story he told about the elevator being used and consuming 20 to 25% of the entire budget of this expansion. This is absolutely relevant to the affordability of housing here in America. My family's in construction. Third generation sand and gravel operation, families involved in ready-mix concrete. We have been involved in building homes and providing homes and jobs for decades. And I know what has happened over the number of decades as we have seen not just building code as far as efficiencies. I mean, that is certainly something that has to be weighed out and balanced in the positive aspects of it. But when we are talking about impact fees and other things that have been layered on and layered on and layered on, suddenly housing is much more expensive and is less affordable, and there is certainly a relevance to what we are talking about here today, as we are trying to combat and battle this scourge that's on our country. So with that, I yield back.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yielded back, but sure, go ahead.
The reason why this entire debate is relevant is because the Green New Deal is not existing law. We're debating 1856 within the framework of existing law. Let's talk about that. And if we pass this, then we can talk about the Green New Deal and its consequences to these kind of measures. But for us to be talking about something that isn't even existing statute means it's completely irrelevant to the nature of the discussion. So let's stay focused on what is statute and how that current statute applies to 1856 as it's being debated today. Thank you. I yield back to the...
Reclaiming, appreciate that. Well, I'll point out that none of this is law right now. So we are talking about what should become law. That's why we're here. So if this is a priority of stated members of the committee, then let's make that a priority. If it's not, then let's get people on record for that so we know what we can focus in on. So, so with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Move to strike the last word.
Mr. Caston, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I feel like I need to explain something that I'm shocked that this has to be explained. We are on the Financial Services Committee, and I'm trying to figure out whether people understand the difference between a capital expense and an operating expense. If you spend less money on energy, you save money. This is not complicated. Nobody gives fuel away for free. If you want to spend less money on energy, you're going to have to invest in capital that lowers the cost of energy. I've done that over the course of my career to the tune of about $200 million. If you need explanation, come and meet me. I would love to work with you on the Select Climate Committee because we have an opportunity to invest in our country and make us wealthier and make us cleaner. Those two things are not in conflict unless you don't understand the difference between a capital expense and an operating expense. So if you have committed your career in this body or otherwise to making our country wealthier and cleaner, God bless you. If you have committed your career to blocking investments in energy efficiency, to intentionally confusing different types of expenses to make our economy dirtier and less competitive, shame on you. But in all cases, if you live in a glass house, do not throw stones, and for goodness sakes, don't throw stones at people who don't even have a house. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Strike the last word.
The gentlelady is requesting to strike the last word. Who is in control of the time, Mr.?
Thank you, Chairwoman.
Excuse me, I cannot give you permission. You have to get permission from the person whose time
Oh, no, I'll
you are
wait.
requesting.
No.
Yes, I will yield.
Mr. Caston?
Thank you.
Are you yielding?
Oh, yeah, I was just asking for my full 5 minutes, but it's okay, Chairwoman. I'm getting used to this. But I just wanted folks to know, when everybody said take a, yes, ma'am.
The gentleman's time is over. And so, Ms. Tlaib, I will recognize you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Waters. One of our colleagues said, take a deep breath. Well, if you come to my district, you can't take a deep breath because 1 of 5 children have asthma, 3 times high rate, hospitalization rate among adults, and 3 of my zip codes have some of the most polluting industries in my district. My father, who had cancer, literally White Cross campaigns in my district showing 7 homes in a row of somebody surviving cancer or died of cancer. And we're what we call the front line of what's happening with our climate. We are the ones already dying because we haven't done anything to address climate change in our country. And I just wanted to express that quality of life, of understanding what's actually happening to this, if we truly want to debate this now. But also, it is really important as we talk about homelessness that we lead with compassion, that we understand, and you all know this, that we of course have to look at ways that we get there, but we have to agree that we need to address it. And I think if we all agree to address it, then we can move forward in deciding ways to do that. And I feel like this bill gets us there because we'll find ways to pay for it because it becomes a priority, because people become a priority over anything else, especially those that are the most vulnerable, our veterans, our children, our families. With that, Madam Chairwoman Waters, I would like to yield the rest of my time to my good colleague from New York.
Thank you. And I thank my colleague from Michigan. We talk about cost. We're going to pay for this whether we pass a Green New Deal or not. Because as towns and cities go underwater, as wildfires ravage our communities, we are going to pay. And we are either going to decide if we're going to pay to react or if we're going to pay to be proactive. And what we know is that prevention, when you spend less money on prevention, you can prevent a lot of that damage from happening in the first place. So it's not a question of whether we're going to spend the money, because I'm very sad to say that the government knew that climate change was real starting as far back as 1989 when NASA was reporting this. And the private sector knew way back in the 1970s. So we had until around the time I was born to address this issue. I wish it didn't have to cost so much, but I'm going to turn 30 this year, and for the entire 30 years of my lifetime, we did not make substantial investments to prepare our entire country for what we knew was coming. So now it's coming all up at the end. It's like when we live our whole lives and we don't eat healthily and we don't move and we pursue unhealthy activities. And then at the end of our lives, our healthcare costs are very high. We have the choice to lower the cost now, because I can tell you the cost of pursuing a Green New Deal will be far less than the cost of not passing it. And with respect to our brothers and sisters and neighbors that are in agriculture, bring them to the table. Let's hold hearings. Let's add provisions. Let's amend the legislation to accommodate for the just transition and for the encouragement of those industries to grow. And I would also encourage to my colleague on the other side of the aisle that thinks we're trying to ban cows to actually read the resolution and understand that there's nothing to that effect in the legislation. And not only that, but we're trying to invest in these communities and our agricultural workers so that they can enjoy prosperity into the next century. Thank you very much. I yield the rest of my time back to my colleague from Michigan if she chooses to use it.
No, thank you so much, and I yield back to the chairwoman.
Madam Chair. Thank you very much. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arkansas seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Mr. Hill, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, I think all of us in this committee are very concerned about homelessness and making sure shelter is available, and cost is very, very important. I know that from working in Arkansas with all of our homeless groups on trying to do it in the right way. And so when we talk about things that reduce the per unit cost of a rental unit or a construction unit, it's a big deal, and it does have long-lasting capital expenses. So yes, you can have lower operating expenses in the out years, but you still have this capital expense that has to be accounted for. And by the estimates that Mr. McHenry offered, you're talking about something that's 4 or 5 times the annual outlays of HUD in the housing area. With that, I yield to my friend from Wisconsin.
Thank you. I appreciate the gentleman for yielding. Again, I think there's a concern or lack of concern for the cost of this legislation on the homeless. And I love when people say, I've got a great idea that's going to price you out of a home because the world is going to end in 12 years. But if the world is going to end in 12 years, wouldn't you change your own behavior? If this was a crisis, wouldn't you say, I better change the way I behave? I shouldn't focus on changing everybody else. I should change myself. So maybe instead of flying to Washington, I might take the train. And maybe instead of driving in a big Suburban, I might drive in a little Prius. Or if you're the socialist from the Senate who's running for the presidency, maybe you wouldn't ask the Hillary Clinton campaign to fly you on a private jet all over the country to campaign for her, all the while claiming the world is going to end in 12 years while you're spewing carbon all over the place in your private jet. Or maybe if you're the Speaker of the House, you might say, I'm not going to take that private jet to California because Speaker Paul Ryan, he took commercial air travel to Chicago and drove up to his place in Wisconsin. Speaker John Boehner, he too flew commercial. But the ones that now claim that we have a crisis in 12 years, they're the ones that take the SUVs and the private jets.
Madam Chair, I'm going to object.
If you really believe
to this is
really
becoming personal,
that global warming is happening,
I'm going to object
you would take
these questions
you would take
pointing out specific names and becoming
Mr.
personal,
Perlmutter,
and it's so off.
Madam Chair, this is my time.
Will the gentleman please? The time belongs to the gentleman from
Arkansas,
who has yielded to the gentleman from Wisconsin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And the point is that let's focus on ourselves. Let's focus on our families. Let's focus on our own party and the decisions that we make. And so what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And when we say we'll take private jets and SUVs, and then we want to pass a bill that says poor people are going to have a radical increased cost for their homes that may price them out of their home or price them out of their rental unit, I find that fundamentally unfair. And it concerns me when, again, I say this works for the rich who can take the Suburbans and the private planes. It works for them. But we're talking about the poorest among us who can't afford it. And again, lead by example. Take the train. Take a commercial flight. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman for the time, and I yield the time back to the chair.
Thank you very much. I move to strike the last word. This amendment does not reflect the nuanced goals of the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal does not require environmental efficiency without consideration for the cost. In fact, affordability of housing is included as one of the goals of the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal is not a rigid one-size-fits-all approach. In fact, the resolution states that the projects will be community-defined projects and strategies and calls for inclusive consultation with community members. Now, as a matter of principle, the gentleman from Wisconsin has said he does not intend to vote for his own amendment. And since he's not voting for his own amendment, I would encourage my colleagues to follow suit, and I feel back the balance of my time.
Would the gentlelady yield?
No, the gentlelady does not yield. Does the gentlewoman withdraw her point of order?
Madam Chair, I withdraw my point of order, but I congratulate my colleague from New York for her hard work on this legislation that would improve the health and lives of Americans.
Thank you very much.
Is there further debate on the amendment? If there's not further debate on the amendment, the question occurs on the amendment. All those in favor of the amendment say aye.
Exactly.
All those opposed say nay.
Nay.
In the opinion of the chair, the nays have it,
Madam
the nays
Chair,
have it, and the amendment is
I'd ask
not
for a
agreed
recorded
to.
vote. Recorded vote.
I now ask for the yeas and nays. He did ask for the yeas and nays. A recorded vote has been requested. All in favor of a recorded vote shall raise their hand and be counted. There is a sufficient second and a recorded vote is so ordered. Pursuant to Section C5 of Rule 3 of the Committee Rules, the vote on this question is postponed. Is there discussion of or further amendments on H.R. 1856?
Madam Chair. Madam Chair.
What purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have an amendment at the desk.
Wrong Florida. It was Mr. Lawson.
Who's Mr. Lawson? From Florida? Mr. Lawson from Florida.
Last word. Thank you, Madam Chair. And I've seen this discussion go from affordable housing to climate change. And you know, what is interesting is, you know, I agree with both of them, but we were talking about affordable housing. And there's so many issues that affect people in affordable housing. Yes. I was looking at my colleague, Congressman Posey, and in my 28 years in working with members on both sides of the aisle in Florida, we never had these kind of discussion where you would bring in a lot of issues that are irrelevant in dealing with the housing area because many of you might not know what it's like to be homeless. I do, because we lost everything and we was homeless for a while. And I can tell you that people, the way we got help during those particular times is really through relatives. You know, somebody take you in for a while until you had to go someplace else. I would say to my colleagues, one of the things that people express about home is how broken Congress is because people really don't want to work on the issues. There should be committees that we should work on to resolve the issues on both sides as related to homelessness and come together and pass something to really affect the American people. We shouldn't really be involved in all of these allegations and insinuations that are kind of toxic about what you're doing with homelessness. So when people watch Congress on television, they look at some people who are really trying to get something done. It's not to criticize. I used to tell people that I had friends on both sides of the aisle, and I'm gonna go with my friends. And so what I would say to us as we tackle something like this, which is so critical in America, and the other day I was riding here in D.C., And I was able to see a lot of people getting prepared for the night to sleep on the street. I'm not sure whether they were veterans. Some people had a cup, you know, trying to get money for various things. And I know that we all talk about it on the campaign trail as much as I've talked about it, about what are we going to do about homeless veterans. And I have a large number of them in the Duval area, which is in Jacksonville, Florida. And there are various groups in there who are dependent on us here in Congress, organization, to help them be able to deal with the homeless crisis, not so much sometimes as putting them in houses, but to put them in shelters to take them off the street. I encourage members to look inside and see what we are doing and to bring those issues forward that you have in different philosophies, but at the same time, don't really try to insult each other, because this issue is too big for all of us, to make sure that we do something to solve the problem that exists. I can guarantee you that anything that comes out of here that's going to help some of the people who can't help themselves, they will thoroughly appreciate it. You know, when you talk to homeless people on the street, they don't ask whether you're a Democrat or Republican. The only thing they asked about is whether, you can help us. Just a little help, to people to get on their feet. And so it's really embarrassing when you stay in a meeting for 2 or 3 hours and you have people that are going back and forth about who's right, who's wrong, what's going on in America and so forth. Instead of walking out of here and say we solve one problem, it might not benefit everyone, but I think it will benefit some people. I admire all of you. I like working with you. But this is just not the way we should function here in Congress. Many of you are very intelligent and have had opportunities in life. And I know that we can tackle an issue such as homelessness, and everybody don't win. But sometimes we come down on the side of what we're going to do for the people out there, not what party is going to gain the most from it, but what can we do on a sensible basis so it don't seem so incomprehensible to the general public. So I ask you all, if there's something that we need to do to make this legislation better, that maybe we can do it, but let's make sure that we do it in a distinguished manner of what the American people expect us to do. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The committee will stand in recess.
The gentlelady, in the...
I yield to the gentleman.
In the discussion we just had,
Yes.
I thought the intention was to do another amendment before you
No, the
recess.
intention is not to do another amendment this evening. All of the chairs of our committee are due to be at the Feds at 6 o'clock this evening. And so I'm asking the ranking member to please support our need to recess and begin with the Mr. Posey's amendment tomorrow at 10 a.m.
So further inquiry for the chair. What is the chair's intention tomorrow for the markup as we continue this bill and then 3 additional bills that require significant amendment too? Our
intention is to complete our work by 6 or 7 o'clock tomorrow evening.
I would further inquiry with the chair. What is the chair's intent in terms of the order of markup tomorrow for legislation?
We will continue the markup tomorrow in the order that it has been indicated.
What is the next bill intended? When are we going to get to cannabis banking is my question, right? There's a great deal of intent on that and interest, and I would say as a matter of public policy, the one that has far more consequence in terms of getting into law, I think Mr. Perlmutter would say that.
Okay, my staff has given me the order. We are going to complete homelessness. Then we'll have Mr. Caston's H.R. 1815. And then we'll have that great bill that you're interested in, H.R. 1595 cannabis. Is that sufficient?
Well, we just want to make sure there's sufficient time. I know when the chair was ranking member under the last chair, there were significant complaints about the minority in moving along too expeditiously on markups. I want there to be plenty of time for members to have their input and say on this. As I said in my opening, and cannabis banking, there is significant interest on the Republican side in favor of that bill, but we also have amendments that I think are very important for us to discuss on that legislation.
Well, I am aware of the ranking member's interest, and we certainly are going to spend whatever time is needed with the amendments that you are indicating. This is a two-day mark.
Would the gentlelady yield? Mr. Perlmutter over here.
The gentlelady is going to yield to Mr. Perlmutter, and we did not think that we gave sufficient recognition to the point that you were trying to make earlier.
I just am very happy that Mr. McHenry and so many others are interested in this bill after 6 years of waiting for that interest to be shown. So
well, if the gentleman,
I'd yield back to the lady.
If the gentleman yields, I was not the ranking member on the side.
I'm sorry, Mr. McHenry.
You can take whatever shot.
The time belongs to Mr. McHenry. Please, go right ahead.
If they're sincere, I would ask the gentlelady, I would state to the chair that while the last chairmanship was not to the gentleman's liking from Colorado, I know there's sincere interest in making sure this bill actually functions for the result that the author wants it to.
And I appreciate
and there is sincerity on that.
I'm just making
and if there's
a joke.
sincere interest,
Gentlemen, the time belongs to Mr. McHenry. Mr. Perlmutter, go ahead.
So I hope that my colleague from Colorado will get rest, come back with a little happier outlook, perhaps take his own medicine. And with that, I would yield back to the chair, and thank you for the spirit. Thank you for the spirit in which that's offered.
Thank you very much, Mr. Perlmutter. I think that Mr. McHenry has indicated they're all very high on this bill. And so,
well played.
With that, the committee is in recess.